Hello, listeners. Today we are releasing another episode from our new series entitled The Gene Simmons of Data Protection, the KISS Method, brought to you by none other than Protegrity. Protegrity is AI-powered data security for data consumption, offering fine-grained data protection solutions so you can enable your data security, compliance, sharing, and analytics. In this episode, we will be talking with Clyde Williamson, Senior Product Security Architect. Clyde is going to help us see how we've created a broken system and that it's okay if we're willing to take the necessary steps to fix it. Businesses face immense pressure to safeguard data, ensure compliance, follow regulation, and make data easily available when needed. This is the conversation we should have had yesterday when it comes to our data. Well, Clyde, thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for being on Code Story.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Before we jump into our topic for today, tell me a little bit about you outside of being involved in cybersecurity and technology.
I love history. I love gaming. I'm involved in a couple of national live-action role-playing games. In fact, I'm running one at a convention later this week. I used to love doing sword fighting, medieval sword fighting, Renaissance sword fighting with the group Society for Creative Anachronism. I've aged myself out a bit from there, a couple of back injuries, and I can't do that anymore, but I still love the research.
Very cool. Okay, so history's broad, right? Is there any specific area that you like or era or something like that?
Oh, I love history overall, mostly because I enjoy watching the causes and effects of history, because you can map everything that's going on today and just map it back through massive amounts of time, because this happened and that caused this to happen and that created this situation. The thing caused this to happen. And I just find that sort of thing fascinating.
No doubt. Okay, so then you said a couple of back injuries with the sword fighting. I could totally see that. There's a lot there to get hurt, with. That makes me feel like you probably are into maybe like Renaissance fairs and things like that. Have you attended those and been to?
Oh yeah. I've done Renaissance fairs for years, and of course, like I said, a lot of the research stuff was fun, especially when you got to practice it. We, in fact, some friends and I have even thrown medieval or Renaissance era feasts for a couple hundred people at a time at some of these events, which are really fun. You go back to like period historical recipe books and find actual recipes and recreate those to the best of your ability, given the current times and the fact that some of the things they recommend you do are not safe. So you have to adjust those a little bit, but don't put mercury in the food. That's not a good idea.
Fair. That sounds really fun. Okay, let's dive into the meat of it. So our title for today's episode, Fortifying Your Data Defenses. And this is all around kind of the conversation that should have happened yesterday. So these are all things that, we should know, right? The things that we're going to talk about. Why is consumer privacy more critical today than ever in today's digital world, right? And what role do businesses play in protecting and consuming data? Right, because everybody's got a place at the table here, right, to protect consumer data. But why is it so critical today? And what role do businesses play?
It's interesting. It becomes more critical almost because it's become a daily occurrence. And what I mean by that is everybody's used to having their data compromised. Everybody has gotten, at this point, almost everybody has gotten something in the mail that says your data has been compromised. And you might think, once my data has been compromised, that's it. It doesn't matter anymore. But that's not really true, especially in the world that we have today, because it used to be that somebody wanted to steal your personal information so they could try to open up credit in your name or put something on your credit card or get into your bank account. But the banks and the credit card companies, for the most part, have done a really good job of locking those systems down, right? They have really strong regulations around how you handle credit card data. They require that all those individual credit card numbers be encrypted or protected at rest, tokenized. In those environments, we've highly secured the situation, but people don't think about what the other risks are when your privacy data gets compromised. Recently, we've seen attacks where people will call on the phone, some scammer will call on the phone, present themselves as perhaps a policeman. They will have your private information, so they will know that, for example, you have a grandchild who is currently going to college in somewhere that is not near you. And that makes a great situation for a policeman to call up and be like, I have your grandchild here. He's unconscious. We need to get him to a hospital. We've got to get a down payment to the hospital, so they'll take him. And that grandparent will happily hand over money because the person calling them on the phone is in an emergency and they have information that makes them sound like they know what they're doing. Those kinds of attacks are happening more and more, and people just aren't realizing how at risk they are every time their personal information gets compromised.
It's pretty frightening when you think about it. How does this concern for, protecting data translate to regulatory requirements and changes for businesses from that angle, right? What does it mean to future-proof consumer data in terms of regulatory compliance, and why should businesses care?
As I mentioned a moment ago, the credit card companies got really serious about protecting the credit card data. Not so much because it was the customer's personal information and they cared, but because obviously if somebody compromised that data and created fraud, then that hit their bottom line. So the businesses cared because it hit their bottom line. And because of that, they put serious requirements in place about how you handled that kind of data. And since then, in the years since the implementation of the PCI standard, the amount of credit card data theft has dropped dramatically. PII theft has continued on pretty much unabated, at least here in the United States. When we look at GDPR in the European Union, for example, or some of the other areas with privacy laws, Singapore, Canada, pretty much most of the first world countries on the planet and several others, I think 75% of the countries in the world today have strong privacy laws about how you are supposed to handle the personal information about the citizens of that country. One of the few countries that doesn't have any kind of laws like that is the United States. There are a few states. California has a law. I think New York has a law. Whether or not they can enforce those laws across state lines has become a bit of a contention. We really aren't seeing any teeth in those regulations. So why would a business need to do it? Obviously, they need to be PCI compliant because if not, that's going to hit their bottom line. The credit card companies will charge them more or won't let them handle credit cards. With PII information, you don't have that kind of sledgehammer to force the businesses to do the right thing. And that makes it really challenging. There was a recent case where one of these research companies was a company that did background checks, right? They had collected massive amounts of personal information on many people that they were storing in a database. So you could pay them $29 and get a background check on your daughter's new boyfriend. They hadn't put a password on that database and all that information was exposed. They weren't breaking any laws. All of that data was publicly accessible. They had just collected it in one place and didn't happen to put any security controls whatsoever around that. Now, that company seems to have gone out of business in the few weeks past that. But those types of things occur with frightening frequency. And the question of what is the right thing to do versus what is the minimum legal thing I have to do is really becoming a challenge for organizations to consider.
That makes total sense. Okay. So businesses care because it really, if at the end of the day through, A, B, and C, it hits their bottom line. I'm curious, how can business effectively balance the need for data to be accessible, right? To expose that data to where it's needed with also the need to protect consumer privacy? Because there's a balance there, but it's a difficult one.
Yeah, that's one of the really big challenges, right? There's this idea that the more data I can collect, the more analysis I can do on that data, the better I can serve my customer, the more I can anticipate what they want, the more money I'll be able to make. The downside to having all of that data, of course, is that if you've got all that data and it's all over the place, then that's a lot of different places that you have to worry about protecting. I've got this data, it's in my marketing environment, it's over here in my sales environment. My data scientists have a few copies of it that they're designing new models for it, and they're training models on some of that sensitive data. It's everywhere. One of the things that we see organizations trying to do now is figure out ways to minimize the exposure of that PII data. We don't always need the PII data to do the work. For example, I might need to be able to do matching. I need to be able to verify that this customer who I find in transaction A also exists in transaction B and C on some other table. With technologies like tokenization or other forms of pseudonymization, where you can substitute the real value with a fake value that's consistent, that allows you to do a lot of analytics with the PII data without actually exposing the real name. So instead of having a real person and their real date of birth, you have tokens that represent those things generally. And for some kinds of analytics, these make a lot of sense. There's a huge amount of focus right now on privacy technologies that would allow customers to get what they need, or allow users, organizations to get what they need out of the data without actually exposing any of that data. Now, this is a huge area of research in our industry right now.
Okay, right on. When businesses are wanting to find that balance, make data accessible, but protect consumers' data, they're going to make mistakes. And I'm sure that there are common ones that businesses would run up against that could be avoided by doing a little bit of research, right? Maybe we can help them here. What are some of the common pitfalls that businesses face when implementing privacy measures? And, specifically, like I'm mentioning, how can they avoid them?
Privacy can be really tricky. For example, let's say I have a huge data set of customer information. If I remove the names and addresses, the name, street address, phone number, email address, all those direct identifiers, all the things that can directly say, obviously, we're talking about this person. 20 years ago, we would say that data set is anonymous. There was some research done in the University of Toronto, and they proved that, in fact, the privacy of those records is not anonymous. With nothing more than their gender, their date of birth, and the zip code that the person lives in. Just those three pieces of information is enough to identify about 87% of the people in the United States. The data set they performed this on was an anonymized data set that was created by the state of, I think, Massachusetts, which was about state employees' healthcare. They were able to re-identify and actually identify the governor in that data set and what he had been treated for. Privacy is really tricky. It's very hard to make somebody hidden while still being able to get useful information out of it. So those kinds of issues happen a lot. We've seen the case of Netflix several years ago released a huge amount of anonymous reviews of movies. And people were able to take those and marry them to a couple of other data sets and re-identify the people who were making those reviews, which allowed them to leak information like political leanings and things like that. So there's a lot of examples of privacy done wrong. It's really hard to do privacy right. This is one of those areas where having a set of regulations, like GDPR, for example, provide organizations at least some level of guidance about what it means for something to be properly privacy preserved or privacy protected. Today in the United States, there's not a lot of direction on that, and organizations are left to fend for themselves. So anybody that's really attempting to apply privacy controls to their data, it's key to find an organization or bring somebody on board who is an expert in the concepts of privacy. It's a really complex area. A lot of European organizations actually have a chief privacy officer. That's a requirement in GDPR. So a lot of even US organizations now that operate in Europe will have a chief privacy officer. That's a great idea for organizations looking to implement these kinds of protections.
So if a business can improve consumer trust, it will affect their bottom line positively, right? Can you provide an example of a company that improved their consumer trust around this specific area where they adopted stronger data protection strategies and then consumers trusted them more?
That's an interesting challenge. And it's because a lot of organizations that implement strong security and privacy controls don't really talk about it. Because a lot of organizations that talk about it or that do those things think that by talking about it, that might expose them to some risk. So I talk a little bit generically, but we certainly have worked with organizations who have either gone through a scenario where some significant amount of data has been exposed. And now, as part of regaining customer trust, they're implementing strong security controls. They're making key organizational changes. And we've seen over the years, those kinds of organizations continue to recover and grow. There are some examples where we see organizations like the one I mentioned earlier that went out of business within a week of being compromised, but those are rare. In the United States, it's interesting. 20 years ago, we would have thought, oh, a company gets compromised. That's going to be a huge hit to their bottom line. It's going to be a black eye. Customers will not trust them. But what we found is a lot of times they still do. One of the things that I think a lot of forward-thinking organizations are looking at right now isn't so much what do I have to do today to be compliant, but really what do I need to do now so that whatever changes in the future, I won't have a lot of catch-up work to do. PCI, I'm going to go back to that again as an example because it's one of the best regulatory controls we have here in the US. It very clearly defines how you should protect credit card data. And some organizations found shortcuts around that. They found ways to meet the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And when PCI's updates have come out over the years, one by one, they've closed those loops. And organizations have had to go back and retrofit or redesign or re-implement security controls to bring them into line with where they need to be. I think we'll see that here eventually in the United States, where the government will start to enforce privacy regulations, and organizations that aren't thinking about it right now are going to have to think about it later.
So then, in the spirit of innovation, I'm certain there are emerging technologies that are helping businesses accomplish that they can implement, they can, adopt methodologies and make an impact. What are some of those emerging technologies, specifically in data protection and cybersecurity, that are making that type of impact?
I mentioned a few of the new privacy preserving techniques that have been coming into focus. Anonymization is one of those where you remove the identity of the individual, but you can retain the characteristics of the general group. That's great for certain kinds of analytics. There's a very interesting kind of privacy implementation called differential privacy. To use a really simple explanation, anytime you ask a question, it flips a coin. And if it comes up heads, it tells you the correct answer. If it comes up tails, it flips the coin again. If it comes up heads the second time, it tells you the right answer. If it comes up tails, it tells you a little bit of a fib. In some kinds of analytics, that's no good. But when I'm doing analytics on tens of thousands of people, it turns out that this differential privacy allows me to get really highly accurate analytical data out of there. But at the same time, I can never tell whether any single record is about an actual real individual or a fictional individual, let's say. One of the other really interesting things that we've been doing a lot of research on is synthetic data. So being able to look at a data set full of real people and then generate a data set of people who share the same characteristics as those real people when you look at them at large, but individually, those individuals are completely fictional and unique. It turns out that because when you were dealing with enough numbers, the kinds of analytics that a lot of organizations are doing, a lot of the areas where private data is actually exposed, these kinds of techniques are making inroads. There are a few that are a little further out. There's one called homomorphic encryption. It's really interesting. You can actually do mathematical functions on encrypted data without needing to decrypt it and get the right answer out. So I can take two encrypted values, multiply them together, and get the answer I need without ever knowing what the actual two values were I multiplied together. It's still very slow. It doesn't work in the real world. It's got a lot of issues, but it shows some promise. And I think that there will be some really interesting movement in that area probably over the next couple of years.
Super interesting. It'll be exciting to watch that. And there's obviously the ones you mentioned that have been really interesting as far as how they're making an impact. I'm curious about maybe on the other side, the horror stories, right? Can you share any real world examples of data breaches that could have been prevented, right, with better security practices? Maybe if some of these things were in place already, or maybe businesses would have been a little more proactive.
Wow. There's so many. The one I mentioned earlier, having a database on the internet with no username or password on it whatsoever, that's pretty terrible. There are cases where we've seen data compromise happen often because of, what do I want to call it, phishing, right? So somebody inside the organization gets an email, they click a link, and now their system is infected with something. And it turns out that if you can tightly control who's getting access to what kinds of sensitive data, those risks are less, right? So if I say, for example, marketing needs to know the names and the email addresses and the street addresses, but they don't need to know any of the other information. Or my sales audit people, they need to know the name and the street address and the credit card number maybe, but they don't need to know any other information. And I can continue to limit the access to sensitive data down to the individual role and what they need to do for their job. Then when an individual gets compromised, when somebody clicks on a link they shouldn't, it's not good, right? The system still gets infected. You can't stop that necessarily, but you've limited the exposure down to the bare minimum of what that person might be able to get into. And we've seen this throughout organizations as a whole. One of the really nice things that happened with PCI, and I'm going to say nice because I used to be in the industry as a security architect for big retail organization. We had, before PCI, we had data security spread all over. There were a number of different brands under our organization. We had acquired them during different times. That meant they had all kinds of different platforms that didn't really work with each other. So customer data was everywhere. Credit card data was everywhere. When we had to implement protections to start getting that under control, we found that by pushing everything into the architecture that PCI requires, where basically credit card data only exists inside this little secured subnet, we reduced the amount of effort and focus that we as a security team had to put in all of those other areas. All of a sudden, all the sensitive data goes into one location. I can focus all my security on that location. Everywhere else was using token representations of the credit card instead of the real credit card. Those kinds of techniques, I think, are going to see a resurgence in PII as well. Being able to keep the privacy information, the personal information, in a secured location, where maybe we can do analytics on it over there and get results, but not actually expose that to real people. We're doing some experiments right now with agentic techniques that might have some promise there.
That will be interesting to see how that comes to fruition. Well, Clyde, I appreciate you being on the show today. I think it's clear that businesses need to take data privacy seriously. There are new rules and regulations coming out. They need to be compliant, all that sort of stuff, but they also need to be able to make that data available. And there's tools and processes and methodologies that Protegrity is digging into, building and offering as well that are making an impact. So I really appreciate you explaining all that and being on the show today.
Thanks very much.
I hope that Clyde has opened your eyes to the things you should have talked about yesterday. Businesses are under pressure to handle their data the right way and make it readily available where needed. Good news is that there is solid tooling and methodology impacting this area that businesses can implement, adopt, and improve their consumer trust and positively impact their bottom line. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Protegrity, go to protegrity.com. That's PROTEGRITY.com. And thanks again for listening.